By the late 1880s, one tobacco company in Durham, North Carolina could make cigarettes faster than America could absorb them. That was the real crisis. Not how to roll them, how to sell them. For generations, tobacco had been sold through habit, local trade, and familiar labels. Then the factory changed the scale of everything. Machines could now pour out cigarettes in volumes that older selling methods could not match. Once that happened, advertising stopped being decoration. It became part of the production system. That is why this story matters. It is not only about smoke, leaf, and profit. It is about the moment American business learned that mass production needed mass persuasion. Cigar labels, cigarette packs, trade cards, posters, premiums, and brand names all began doing heavier work. They had to make one company feel distinct from the next. They had to create memory at a distance. They had to help factories move mountains of identical product. The tobacco industry did more than dominate a market. It helped teach American commerce how to chase attention. It learned how to make a package behave like a sign. It learned how to turn a tiny printed insert into something people kept. It learned how to make a brand feel familiar before the customer even opened the box. There was a darker side to that success. The same business that sharpened the tools of modern persuasion also showed how dangerous those tools could become when scale outran restraint. If you enjoy deeply researched stories about industry, power, and persuasion, subscribe, because this story begins inside a factory where speed changed everything, and where selling had to become as systematic as production. Chapter 1. The Day Advertising Had to Scale. Before the machine age, the cigarette trade still moved at the speed of human hands. Workers rolled cigarettes by hand, packed them by hand, and produced them in quantities that ambitious owners could expand only so far. The business could grow, but it still had a natural ceiling. That ceiling began to crack in the early 1880s. James Bonsack developed a practical cigarette machine that could produce at a speed no room full of hand rollers could hope to equal. Estimates vary, but the machine was widely credited with turning out roughly 100,000 or more cigarettes in a single day. That was not a small improvement. It was a break with the old world. At first, many tobacco manufacturers hesitated. Some doubted the machine would work reliably. Some feared buyers would look down on machine-made cigarettes. Others simply trusted the older way because it was familiar. That hesitation opened a gap in the market, and one young businessman in Durham moved into it with unusual speed. James Buchanan Duke saw that the machine was not just a labor-saving device, it was a weapon. He leased Bonsack machines in the 1880s and worked to improve how they operated in his factories. He also secured terms that lowered his production costs below those of rivals who still depended on slower methods. That advantage mattered. It meant he could produce more, price more aggressively, and push farther than competitors who still lived in the older rhythm of the trade. Soon the numbers became startling. Duke's company began moving from ordinary factory output into industrial volume. By the late 1880s, production had climbed into the millions of cigarettes per day. Earlier factories had measured daily output in the tens of thousands. Duke's operation had burst through that scale. What had once been a busy tobacco business now looked more like a manufacturing engine. That is the point where this becomes a story about advertising. A company that can make millions of cigarettes now faces a brutal question every morning. How do you persuade enough people to choose your brand, ask for it by name, and keep buying it in sufficient volume to clear the factory floor? Once output reached that scale, demand could no longer be treated as something that would quietly appear on its own. Demand had to be built, reinforced, and repeated. A slower trade can survive on habit. A mass production trade cannot. It needs recognition. It needs labels that stand out in a crowded shop. It needs packaging a customer can remember after a quick glance. It needs cards, signs, posters, and names that travel farther than the salesman can. In other words, it needs persuasion that is systematic. Duke understood that earlier than most of his rivals. In the year 1889, he reportedly spent about 20% of gross sales on advertising, roughly $80,000. That figure matters because it reveals his logic. Advertising was not a decorative expense. It was part of the machinery. The factory made cigarettes. Advertising moved them. This is where the title makes sense. The tobacco factories did not invent every technique that later appeared in American advertising. They did something just as important. They created conditions in which persuasion had to become organized, visual, repetitive, and national in scale. Production was no longer the only challenge. The market itself had to be worked with equal force. That change reshaped the relationship between factory and customer. Once cigarettes became cheaper and more plentiful, the struggle shifted toward attention. A smoker in one city had to notice a brand among many. A shopkeeper had to stock it with confidence. A passerby had to remember a label, a color, or a pack design long enough to choose it later. The selling process had to travel ahead of the purchase. The old tobacco trade had relied heavily on proximity. A known merchant sold to known buyers. The new cigarette trade needed something larger. It needed impressions that could spread beyond one neighborhood or one personal network. That is why packages became more important. That is why brand names became more important. That is why printed material became more important. The machine had made scale unavoidable, and scale changed what selling had to do. There was also a human cost in this transformation. Skilled handwork lost ground as mechanization spread. Smaller firms faced pressure they could not easily match. Even the prejudice against machine-made cigarettes began to weaken under the pressure of price, volume, and promotion. Duke did not wait for the public to slowly adjust. He produced aggressively, sold aggressively, and helped force the market into a new shape. By the time competitors fully grasped what Bonsak's machine had made possible, the deeper lesson was already clear. The winning tobacco company would not be the one that simply made cigarettes efficiently. It would be the one that could turn output into desire, labels into recognition, and repetition into loyalty. The machine solved the production problem. From that moment on, advertising was asked to solve the rest. Chapter 2. From cigar labels to brand seduction. Before tobacco companies learned to flood the country with cards, coupons, and slogans, they learned something simpler. A label could stop the eye. That may sound obvious now. It was not obvious in the middle of the 19th century. Early product labels often did a plain job. They named the maker. They marked the brand. They told buyers what sat inside the box. Over time, that changed. As color printing improved, labels became more ambitious. Text was joined by illustration. Utility was joined by attraction. A name alone no longer seemed enough. Tobacco made that shift easy to see. The Library of Congress holds a tobacco label collection of about 900 items, dating from about the 1840s to the 1890s, with most from the years between the early 1860s and the late 1880s. The collection reflects politics, popular culture, theater, animals, flags, courtship, mythology, and much more. These labels were not simply naming tobacco. They were borrowing from the wider visual world around the customer. That mattered because a cigar box sat in public. It rested on counters. It appeared in shop windows. It passed through the hands of buyers and shopkeepers. The box itself became a display surface. A dull label could mark a product. A vivid label could perform for it. Chromolithography made that possible at a much higher level. Hagley notes that chromolithography reached the United States in the 1840s. By the late 19th century, it had become a popular advertising tool, especially among cigar manufacturers, who used bright labels to attract attention. Hagley also makes a broader point. Many colorful packages and advertisements that now feel ordinary grew out of techniques learned in that chromolithographic era. This was more than decoration. It was a shift in commercial logic. Once the label became colorful, figurative, and theatrical, it began doing persuasive work before a clerk spoke a single word. A customer might know nothing about the blend inside the box. Still, one label could look richer, newer, finer, or simply more memorable than another. Here the selling method changed. A tobacco product no longer introduced itself by substance alone. It introduced itself through atmosphere. One label could suggest refinement. Another could suggest patriotism. Another could suggest humor, swagger, or sentiment. The box became a small stage, and the brand began performing a version of itself. The visual range was extraordinary. Library of Congress material shows tobacco labels drawing on animals, women, entertainers, Indians of North America, flags, military subjects, mythology, sports, courtship scenes, and comic material. That variety tells us something important. These labels were not trying to explain Leaf. They were trying to trigger recognition, mood, and curiosity. They reached for whatever images the culture already knew how to read. That is where seduction enters the story. Not seduction in the narrow romantic sense, seduction in the advertising sense. A product began to present an outer personality. One box could flatter the buyer with hints of taste. Another could promise distinction. Another could make the purchase feel lively, modern, or respectable. The label was no longer a tag, it was an argument. This helps explain why tobacco became such fertile ground for visual selling. Cigars and other tobacco goods were sold in forms that rewarded presentation. The package was visible, it lingered in view, it could be handled and examined. It worked at the exact point where merchandise met the eye. That made packaging unusually powerful as a bridge between production and desire. This is an interpretation, but it fits the documented role these labels played in attracting customer attention. It also changed the role of the printer and the lithographer. Once labels had to attract, not merely identify, printing became a strategic part of selling. Color mattered, composition mattered, symbol choice mattered. The front of the box was no longer an afterthought. It had become part of how the product entered the market. Hagley places cigar manufacturers near the center of this development, which helps explain why cigar labels occupy such an important place in the visual history of American packaging. There was another advantage to tobacco labels. They were small enough to feel intimate, yet vivid enough to feel theatrical. A newspaper notice vanished with the day. A wall poster stayed fixed in one place. But a tobacco label sat much closer to the act of buying. It could be lifted, studied, and remembered. Sometimes, it could even be saved. That gave tobacco manufacturers a quiet lesson in human attention. Surface was not superficial. The exterior of a product could shape choice before the buyer judged the goods inside. In that sense, the cigar label became an early training ground for brand thinking in America. That is a synthesis, not a direct archival phrase, but it follows from the package-centered selling role documented in the period sources. Long before cigarette makers began adding cards, albums, and other premiums, this lesson was already in place. Packaging was not neutral. A box could carry prestige, it could carry narrative, it could carry memory. This chapter matters for a quieter reason. The factories in the earlier chapter created the pressure to move goods faster and farther. But even before promotion became a full industrial system, tobacco producers had already learned a crucial principle. A package could make an argument. It could whisper quality. It could promise distinction. It could signal belonging. It could turn a plain box into an invitation. That was the beginning of brand seduction. And once tobacco companies understood how powerful that could be, they pushed the lesson much further. Chapter 3. Allen and Ginter and the Invention of Collecting. An advertisement is supposed to vanish. You see it, you register it, then you move on. Allen and Ginter found a way to break that pattern. In the late 1880s, the Richmond tobacco firm began issuing small illustrated cards in cigarette packs and in branded series that did something far more powerful than ordinary promotion. They made people want to keep the advertisement itself. That was the real trick. The basic idea was simple. Tobacco cards were first issued in cigarette packages. They helped stiffen the soft packs. They also promoted sales and encouraged brand loyalty. What changed with Allen and Ginter was the ambition of the thing. These were not plain inserts with a logo and a price. They were colorful little objects printed in sets, tied to themes, and designed to reward repeated buying. That shift changed the role of the customer. In the earlier chapter, the package itself became persuasive. Here, the buyer becomes part of the advertising system. The smoker is no longer just purchasing tobacco. He is also chasing a sequence. He wants the missing card. He wants the complete run. He wants the one his friend does not have. The advertisement is no longer consumed and forgotten. It is pursued. Allen and Ginter pushed this method hard. The company issued series of 50 cards to promote its cigarette brands. In 1887, it released World's Champions, a set that included baseball players alongside athletes from other sports. In 1888 and 1889, it followed with more themed series, including flags, government buildings, national types, and fashionable fans. The variety was not random. It kept the product fresh while preserving the collecting habit. The deeper change came next. A normal advertisement repeats the same message. These cards created repetition through variation. The brand stayed present, but the image changed. One purchase might bring a wrestler, the next might bring a flag, then an inventor, then a baseball player, then a building in Washington. The tobacco company had found a way to make serial advertising feel like discovery. The cards also solved a problem that ordinary print advertising could not solve very well. A newspaper advertisement lasted a day. A poster stayed in one place. A trade card handed out in a shop could be discarded. A tobacco insert arrived inside a private purchase and traveled into the buyer's pocket, home, or scrapbook. It stayed close. That mattered even more once albums appeared. Larger illustrated albums were made available for collectors. Allen and Ginter also issued souvenir albums tied to card series, including a World's Inventors album in the late 1880s. That detail is revealing. The company was not just handing out inserts, it was building a full collecting system around them. That system did two things at once. It rewarded loyalty. It also trained anticipation. A smoker who wanted to complete a set had a reason to come back again and again. The more the set mattered, the more valuable the next pack became. The next purchase was not only tobacco, it was possibility. Allen and Ginter also widened the imaginative range of advertising. Its cards were not confined to tobacco scenes. The company promoted cigarettes with champions, inventors, flags, government buildings, and scenes of fashion and culture. That mattered because it widened the emotional field around the brand. A cigarette company could now attach itself to sport, knowledge, patriotism, elegance, or curiosity. That move feels familiar now because it became normal later. At the time, it was clever. It let tobacco advertising escape the narrow limits of product description. A card could be educational, it could be decorative, it could be competitive, it could be collectible. All the while, the brand name stayed in the frame. The baseball connection made that especially potent. Baseball cards first became widely popular in the 1880s when tobacco companies used them to stiffen cigarette packages and promote sales. Allen and Ginter's World's Champions from 1887 is widely treated as the first significant tobacco card set. Other firms soon followed. Allen and Ginter did not remain alone for long, but it helped prove the model. And that may be the most important point in the chapter. Allen and Ginter did not invent the human urge to collect. It did something more commercially useful. It fused that urge to brand promotion in a repeatable format. The company turned the advertisement into a desirable object, then turned that object into a series, then turned the series into a reason to return. That was not the whole of modern advertising, but it was one of its clearest early moves. By this point, the tobacco trade had learned three increasingly powerful lessons. First, a package could attract the eye. Second, a label could give a product atmosphere. Now came the third lesson. A tiny printed object could turn promotion into habit. That was more than clever merchandising. It was the moment advertising became something people collected on purpose. Chapter 4. Baseball, Beauty, and the New Consumer. A tobacco card could do more than entertain. It could flatter. It could invite imitation. It could make a buyer feel that a cigarette belonged to a larger world of fame, style, sport, and admiration. The method had now become more personal. In the previous chapter, tobacco companies discovered that people would keep the advertisement itself. Now the card did a different kind of work. It attached the brand to faces the public already wanted to look at: athletes, actresses, celebrated beauties. The product was beginning to borrow identity from the people and images printed on the card. Baseball was central to that shift. Baseball cards first became popular in the 1880s when tobacco companies used them to promote sales. The subject soon became the most popular theme in tobacco cards, with players and teams appearing across the years from the late 1880s into the early 20th century. That mattered because baseball was not just another theme, it was a rising mass sport. When a tobacco company placed ball players inside cigarette packs, it linked the brand to competition, celebrity, and public excitement. Allen and Ginter understood that early. Its World's Champions set from the late 1880s included baseball players alongside athletes from other sports, and it is widely treated as the first significant tobacco set. That gave cigarette advertising something new. It gave the customer not just a product or a collectible, but a small encounter with public fame. A smoker did not need to attend a game to feel connected to the sport. The card carried the athlete into the pocket, the shop, and the home. That kind of attachment was powerful because it worked through admiration. A plain package could identify a brand. A baseball card could make the brand feel lively and modern. It could suggest speed, skill, and status without saying any of those things directly. This is an inference, but it follows from the subject choice and from the later popularity of baseball cards in tobacco promotion. The company was no longer selling only tobacco. It was selling proximity to a public culture people already cared about. The same logic appeared in another register with actresses and beauty series. Allen and Ginter issued multiple card programs built around female performers and glamorous imagery. Some promoted Virginia Brights, Dixie, Our Little Beauties, and Opera Puff cigarettes. Others promoted Little Beauties and related brands. These were not obscure side experiments. The company returned to actresses and beauty repeatedly across several series and years. The beauty cards pushed this even further. World's Beauties appeared in sets of 50 cards in the late 1880s to promote Allen and Ginter cigarettes. One surviving card identified Louise Montague as the $10,000 beauty. That phrase tells you the tone of the campaign. Beauty was being ranked, priced, admired, and circulated. The card did not merely show a woman. It turned her into a talking point, a collectible image, and a branded object all at once. A different kind of buyer was now being imagined. The customer was no longer addressed only as someone who wanted tobacco. He was being addressed as someone who followed stars, recognized faces, admired athletes, noticed fashion, and responded to glamour. The card assumed a richer inner life in the buyer. It assumed fandom. It assumed curiosity. It assumed aspiration. Those are interpretive terms, but they fit the repeated turn toward actors, actresses, beauties, and champions as advertising subjects. This changed how persuasion worked. Earlier labels gave a product atmosphere. These cards gave the brand companions. A cigarette no longer stood alone on the counter. It arrived beside a ball player, a stage actress, or a famous beauty. The image could do emotional work that the product itself could not do. It could make the brand seem fashionable, worldly, exciting, or desirable before the tobacco was even lit. The scale of that pattern was not small. The Library of Congress finding aid for the Benjamin K. Edwards collection lists thousands of actor, actress, and model cards across dozens of sets. It also lists hundreds of women-themed cards across many more sets. Those women-themed categories include idealized beauty, stage roles, women representing the states, song-based imagery, and other stylized subjects. That breadth shows this was not an occasional flourish. Tobacco advertisers kept returning to the female figure as a selling surface. Baseball did one kind of work. Beauty did another. Baseball offered legitimacy through a sport that was becoming part of American public life. It gave cigarette brands motion, rivalry, and recognizable heroes. Beauty cards worked more through fantasy and display. They let the brand circulate images of grace, glamour, flirtation, and status. Together, those subjects widened the emotional range of tobacco advertising. One card could make a brand feel masculine and competitive. Another could make it feel elegant and socially alive. That widening pointed beyond the product itself. A consumer could now choose a cigarette brand partly through the company it kept. This was not yet the full 20th century language of lifestyle marketing, but the outline was visible. Tobacco companies had begun linking brands to identities people already recognized or desired. Sport, theater, celebrity, and beauty were becoming part of the sales pitch. The change seems simple from the present. Of course companies use athletes. Of course they use actresses. Of course they borrow glamour. In the late 19th century, though, this marked a serious development. It meant the advertisement no longer had to speak mainly about the tobacco itself. It could speak through borrowed fame and borrowed desire. The product became easier to imagine inside a wider social world. Tobacco advertising had moved from display to attachment, from attraction to association, from a product on a label to a brand surrounded by people the public wanted to know, watch, or resemble. Chapter 5. James Duke's Advertising War. James Duke did not advertise like a cautious merchant. He advertised like a man trying to crowd every rival off the shelf. By the late 1880s, Duke was no longer simply making cigarettes faster than most competitors. He was trying to reach the customer's eye before another brand had any chance at all. The factory had already given him speed. Advertising gave him pressure, and he used it everywhere he could. In the year 1889, James B. Duke spent about 20% of gross sales, roughly $80,000, on advertising. Even in a fast-growing trade, that was startling. It was not routine promotion. It was a strategy of force. Contemporaries could see it. Historical scholarship on the early cigarette industry describes Duke as an aggressive advertiser who devised new and startling methods that dismayed his competitors. It also notes that he was willing to spend a share of profits that seemed appalling to more conservative manufacturers. That matters because it shows how unusual he looked even in his own time. He was not simply placing advertisements. He was trying to overwhelm resistance. By the end of the decade, the scale of the result was hard to ignore. A Duke economics teaching source summarizes his position in 1889 this way. The Duke Tobacco Company held about 30% of the cigarette market, with profits of about $400,000 on gross sales of about $4.5 million. That was not passive growth. It was the outcome of a deliberate fight for visibility, retail space, and repeated customer recognition. Duke fought that fight on several fronts at once. He spent heavily on print and display. He pushed branded material into stores. He used premium devices and promotional pieces to make his cigarettes harder to ignore than the pack next to them. The surviving W. Duke, Sons & Company archive shows a wide record of trading cards, albums, and other advertising collectibles across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Those objects mattered here not because this chapter is about collecting, but because they show how Duke kept placing his brand in front of the buyer through many different points of contact. One small example captures the larger logic. In the late 1880s, W. Duke, Sons & Company issued a playing card series to promote Turkish cross-cut cigarettes. Even a card game became a branded surface. That detail is revealing. Duke did not depend on one format. He looked for every opening he could turn into a reminder. He also fought through the sales route itself. One account of Duke's rise describes him packing a bag with samples and making fast trips through the country, taking orders wherever he went, until tobacco shopkeepers were ordering in large quantities. That image matters. The industrialist still acted like a field commander. He did not rely on machines alone. He pushed samples, courted retailers, and made sure Duke cigarettes reached the counter with force behind them. The combination was difficult to resist. Lower production costs gave Duke room to move. Heavy advertising gave him reach. Samples and aggressive selling gave him presence. Repeated promotional material gave him memorability. No single tactic explains the scale of his rise. Together, they begin to show the system. A shopkeeper was offered stock, movement, and excitement. A buyer was offered recognition, novelty, and repeated reminders. A rival had to answer not one tactic, but the whole package at once. This was not polite competition between neighboring brands. It was an escalating struggle to dominate attention in a business where cigarettes were becoming cheaper and easier to produce. Once machine production spread, it became harder to win by manufacturing skill alone. The fight moved outward, into the shop, into the hand, into the display, and into the customer's memory. Duke seems to have understood earlier than most that the decisive battlefield was no longer only the factory floor. It was the market's field of vision. His rivals understood the danger soon enough. Historical accounts argue that advertising was a significant element in the company's success and help explain why Duke gained customers so rapidly. That point matters because it links his promotional spending to market effect. He did not treat advertising as a decorative department. He treated it as part of the same ruthless logic that had already governed his production strategy. There is another detail worth noticing. Duke's advertising was not narrow. It did not depend on a single slogan or a single image. It spread through many small points of contact. A card in a pack, a display in a store, a sample in a salesman's bag, a recognizable package on the shelf, a brand that kept turning up in front of the buyer. Each piece could seem modest on its own. The cumulative effect was much harder for competitors to answer. Duke became difficult to avoid. That may be the sharpest insight in this chapter. Duke understood that advertising did not merely announce supply. It could create momentum. If a retailer kept seeing Duke and a smoker kept seeing Duke, the brand could start to feel larger than it was. Market power often begins as a psychological fact before it becomes a legal one. That is an interpretation, but it fits the speed with which Duke's firm rose to around 30% of the cigarette market by the end of the decade. The larger consequence was already visible. Duke had shown that advertising could be industrialized just as production had been. It could be funded at scale, repeated at scale, coordinated with pricing, salesmanship, and retail presence. What had once been a supporting function was becoming part of the competitive engine itself. The cigarette wars were no longer only about tobacco. They were about who could control attention most completely. Once Duke proved that, the rest of the trade had very little choice. It had to enter the same harsher age of persuasion. Chapter 6. The Trust That Bought the Billboard. By the year 1890, Duke stopped fighting only as a fast and aggressive manufacturer. He began fighting as a system. The American Tobacco Company was formed in 1890 through the merger of 5 major cigarette firms, including W. Duke, Sons & Company, and Allen & Ginter, with James B. Duke as president. This was no longer one firm outrunning its rivals. The rivals were being pulled inside the same structure. That changed the meaning of advertising. In the earlier chapter, Duke fought a promotional war against companies that still stood apart from him. Now many of those companies were being absorbed, aligned, or neutralized. The trust could coordinate what had once been chaotic. It could decide which brands to emphasize, which channels to control, and which regions to saturate. A campaign no longer had to be improvised brand by brand. It could be directed from above. The scale was enormous. Through mergers and purchases, the Duke interests eventually controlled some 150 factories. Historical accounts also describe the trust as controlling almost 90% of the domestic cigarette market in its early years. However one phrases it, the result is the same. This was no longer just a strong cigarette company. It was a manufacturing and distribution empire. And yet the company did not relax its grip on promotion. One of the most revealing details in the historical record is that American Tobacco continued to advertise extensively even after it had achieved dominant market control. Monopoly did not end the need for advertising. It changed its function. Advertising was no longer used only to beat one cigarette rival in a crowded field. It was used to hold the field together, to keep brands visible, and to make the trust's reach feel normal, familiar, and permanent. This is where the chapter title earns its force. The trust did not literally purchase every billboard in America, but it bought something close to the same effect. It assembled such broad control over factories, brands, and distribution that the advertising landscape itself began to bend around its power. If the same corporate family controlled the pack, the insert, the wholesaler, and much of the shelf space, then visibility became easier to standardize. Presence became easier to repeat. The public might still see many names. Increasingly, those names pointed back to the same center. There was also a strategic elegance to the merger. Before consolidation, heavy advertising could be wasteful. A company might spend large sums only to lose ground in a price war or be undercut by a rival using the same methods. Inside the trust, some of that chaos could be reduced. Duke had already shown in the 1880s that production, pricing, and promotion worked best when coordinated. American Tobacco extended that principle across a much larger field. It also meant that advertising no longer belonged to a single product alone. A trust with many brands could position them differently. One could seem refined, another cheap, another modern, another familiar and dependable. The point was not always to make one name win at the expense of all the rest. The point was to make sure the customer remains somewhere inside the trust's orbit. Once multiple brands sit under one roof, the struggle shifts from simple rivalry toward managed segmentation. That helps explain why the trust matters to the history of American advertising. Earlier chapters showed tobacco firms learning how to attract the eye, reward collecting, and borrow glamour. Here the lesson becomes institutional. Advertising is no longer only a clever method. It becomes part of corporate architecture. It sits beside manufacturing, distribution, and finance as one more organized tool of control. The movement is from improvisation to system. The public likely experienced that change in indirect ways. A smoker might still think he was choosing among separate names. A retailer might still see different packages and promotions arriving through ordinary commercial channels. But behind the surface variety, the structure was hardening. A smaller, independent firm no longer had to outwit one flashy advertiser. It had to face a trust that could combine production scale, managed distribution, extensive promotion, and acquisition power. That is the real turning point in this part of the story. The advertising war of the 1880s had now been absorbed into a larger machine. The cigarette campaign became a corporate system. The package, the card, the display, and the sales route no longer worked as separate devices. They worked as parts of a centrally directed order. By then, the American Tobacco Company had done something larger than dominate a product. It had shown how modern promotion could live inside modern consolidation. It had shown that advertising could survive victory because advertising was no longer only about winning customers from rivals. It was about teaching the whole market to live under one roof. Chapter 7. How an advertisement entered the American home. A store display can catch the eye. A package can seal a sale. But the most powerful advertisement is the one that comes home with you. That was the next boundary tobacco companies crossed. Their promotions no longer had to end at the counter. By the late 19th century, tobacco advertising had begun to move into albums, scrapbooks, drawers, parlors, and desks. It became something that could remain in the house after the tobacco itself was gone. The clearest evidence is the album. Larger illustrated albums were made available for tobacco card sets. Collector notes, correspondence, and want lists also survived. That matters because it shows the advertisements were no longer living only in packs or shops. They were being organized, preserved, and revisited over time. Once an advertisement enters an album, it has crossed a boundary. It is no longer just a sales device. It has become part of domestic memory. Allen and Ginter helped build that world deliberately. In the late 1880s, the company issued a World's Inventors souvenir album to promote its cigarettes. Museum records note that albums of this type were probably meant to replace the individual cards, or at least give the smoker a way to own the complete set without finding every single card. That detail is revealing. The company was not only designing a pack insert, it was designing a larger object meant to be kept. The same pattern appears in cabinet cards. Allen and Ginter issued a Cabinet Photos advertising card series in the middle 1880s to promote Virginia Bright cigarettes. These were larger print cards, closer to the format families already knew from portrait photography. That made them feel less like disposable advertising and more like something that could belong among keepsakes. A cigarette brand was beginning to borrow the physical language of the family album and the parlor photograph. Duke material points in the same direction. The W. Duke Sons & Company archive includes trading cards, albums, pins, silk, tobacco tags, and souvenir albums. Duke library material on the same collection also describes 2 large scrapbooks filled with several hundred additional cards. Scrapbooks tell a different story from unopened packs. Someone pasted these things down, someone arranged them, someone made room for them in private space. That is the crucial shift in this chapter. A newspaper notice asked for attention and then vanished. A poster stayed in public. A tobacco card or album could move inward. It could sit in a drawer. It could be shown to a friend. It could be left on a table with other personal objects. The brand was no longer tied only to the moment of purchase. It had found a way to live in spaces where people kept the things they returned to. There was a broader advertising change happening at the same time. Late 19th century advertising increasingly appeared on calendars, postcards, theater programs, maps, menus, booklets, leaflets, and utilitarian objects. Many of those things belonged in homes, even if only for a short while. Tobacco advertising developed inside that wider culture of ephemera. Tobacco firms were among the businesses learning that the advertisement worked best when it attached itself to an object that already had a place in daily life. That point helps explain why the home mattered so much. Inside a shop, repetition felt like competition. Inside a home, repetition could feel like familiarity. A brand that reappeared in an album, on a card, in a scrapbook, or on a household piece of ephemera no longer looked like an intruder every time. It began to seem normal. It blended with leisure, conversation, collecting, and private routine. The afterlife of these objects makes the point even clearer. Collector notes from the late 19th century into the middle 20th century include typed and handwritten want lists for baseball cards and tobacco trade cards. That is not just evidence that people noticed the cards when they first appeared. It is evidence that the cards kept mattering long after the tobacco was sold. The promotional object had acquired a second life in exchange, record-keeping, and preservation. That is the larger meaning of this chapter. Tobacco advertising learned how to stay put. It stayed in albums, it stayed in scrapbooks, it stayed in drawers, parlors, and private collections. Once that happened, persuasion no longer depended only on public display or retail pressure. It could also work through endurance. A brand could return not because it had bought new space, but because an old card, album, or household object was still there. That was a major advance in American advertising. The tobacco trade had already learned how to command the eye. Now it learned how to occupy the room. Chapter 8. Women, Slimness, and the New Language of Persuasion. A cigarette did not need to taste better to win. It needed to mean something else. By the late 1920s, tobacco advertising had learned a sharper move than labels, cards, or store pressure. It learned how to recode the product itself. A cigarette could be sold not as tobacco, but as slimness. Not as smoke, but as poise. Not as habit, but as freedom. The persuasion had moved inside appetite, identity, and social permission. George Washington Hill stood at the center of that turn. After becoming president of American Tobacco in 1925, he pushed Lucky Strike with unusual force. By the following year, Lucky accounted for about 1/5 of United States cigarette sales. In 1925, Lucky Strike was the most popular cigarette in the United States, 5th of United States cigarette sales. In 1927, Hill created what Britannica calls an industry sensation by gearing advertising toward women. Female movie stars and singers praised the brand, and Lucky's share climbed further. That alone would have mattered. But the deeper change came when the campaign stopped selling women a cigarette and started selling them an excuse. By the 1920s, Lucky Strike was being advertised to women as a path to thinness with the slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet." Britannica credits Albert Lasker with helping break down the taboo against women smoking through that line, using actresses and female opera stars in the campaign. The Smithsonian makes the same core point. Stanford's Tobacco Archive adds the sequence. Lucky first rolled out its Cream of the Crop campaign in 1928 with celebrity testimonials from women, then followed with Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet in 1929. That wording changed the argument. Earlier tobacco promotion had asked for attention, admiration, or loyalty. This campaign entered a more intimate space. It suggested that a cigarette could solve a private problem: hunger, weight, self-presentation. The product was being repositioned as a small tool of self-management. That is an interpretation, but it fits the explicit appeal to sweets, dieting, and feminine slimness in the campaign itself. The copy also did something morally clever. It did not say, "Eat less." It did not say, "Deny yourself." It offered substitution. Reach for this, not that. The cigarette became a gesture of control. A woman was not simply consuming tobacco. She was being invited to read the act as discipline, elegance, and modern restraint. That is why this chapter belongs to the history of persuasion, not only to the history of smoking. The advertisement was trying to reshape behavior by reshaping desire. There was another barrier Hill wanted removed. Public smoking by women still carried stigma. Stanford's archive says that before the First World War, smoking in women was associated with loose morals. Marketers in the 1920s and 1930s latched onto women's liberation movements and tried to transform cigarettes into symbols of independence. In 1929, as part of that push, women marched down Fifth Avenue carrying torches of freedom, cigarettes framed as emblems of emancipation. The Library of Congress preserves photographs from Edward Bernays' Torches of Freedom March, staged to promote women smoking in public. That move was larger than a stunt. It translated a social taboo into a publicity opportunity. If slimness addressed the private fear, freedom addressed the public one. A woman no longer had to see smoking as improper. She could be invited to see it as bold, modern, and equal. The product was now wearing the language of liberation. That reading is strongly supported by the Torches of Freedom framing and by the wider woman-targeted campaigns that followed. The structure of the persuasion is what matters most here. It worked on several levels at once. Celebrity endorsements supplied glamour. The thinness appeal supplied personal motive. The freedom language supplied moral cover. Together, those elements made smoking easier to imagine as part of modern womanhood rather than a violation of it. Stanford's archive shows that other cigarette brands soon followed, openly illustrating women smoking rather than merely hinting at it. Once Lucky proved the method, the wider industry moved in the same direction. This is also the point where tobacco advertising begins to sound unmistakably modern. The brand no longer had to argue mainly from product quality. It could speak through insecurity, aspiration, and identity tension. It could enter a person's self-concept and offer a small ritual that seemed to solve the problem. Be thinner, be calmer, be freer, be modern. That was a much more invasive language than the old one. It moved beyond description and into emotional engineering. That final phrase is interpretive, but the historical record supports the larger conclusion. These campaigns were built around weight anxiety, celebrity aspiration, and social permission, not around leaf alone. There is a reason this chapter feels darker than the earlier ones. The beauty cards of the 1880s borrowed glamour. The Lucky Strike campaigns of the late 1920s borrowed the private unease of the customer. That was a deeper reach. Tobacco advertisers had learned that the strongest campaign was not always the one that looked brightest or spent most loudly. It was the one that could enter the mind, rename a vice, and make it feel like self-improvement. That was the new language of persuasion. Chapter 9. Doctors, Celebrities, and Borrowed Authority. A cigarette could be sold with beauty. It could be sold with sport. It could be sold with freedom. But the most audacious move was to sell it with trust. Tobacco advertisers no longer wanted only admiration. They wanted borrowed authority. They wanted the calm face of a doctor, the familiar face of a star, the respected voice of a specialist, all leaning over the product and making it feel safer, wiser, or more socially approved than it was. The earlier chapters already showed the first outline of that method. In the late 1880s, Allen and Ginter issued actress and celebrity cards to promote Little Beauty's cigarettes. Other tobacco card series used stage figures to carry glamour into the pack. Even then, the brand was learning that public recognition could cling to a product. But glamour was only the beginning. A performer could make a brand look fashionable. A doctor could make it look justified. That was the deeper danger. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, tobacco companies commonly enlisted throat specialists and other physicians as endorsers. Public concern about throat irritation had become a problem, and the industry hoped that support from doctors, especially ear, nose, and throat specialists, would calm that fear. This was not a side tactic. It was a direct attempt to turn medical authority into commercial reassurance. Lucky Strike became one of the clearest examples. Its physician campaign ran from the late 1920s into the early 1930s and claimed that 20,679 physicians found Lucky Strike less irritating. Earlier versions used smaller numbers, including 9,651 and then 11,105 doctors. The numbers themselves were part of the performance. The advertisement did not merely say doctors approve, it buried the reader in precision, as though arithmetic itself were proof. That changed how the advertisement felt. A celebrity endorsement asked to be admired. A medical endorsement asked to be trusted. The first works through fascination. The second works through surrender. A consumer does not have to desire a doctor in order to follow one. He only has to believe that the doctor knows better. That is why physician advertising reached more deeply into the mind than the earlier glamour campaigns. The imagery reinforced that effect. Tobacco advertisements in the first half of the 20th century often featured idealized physicians, wise, composed, and benevolent. The goal was clear. The smoker was meant to feel that choosing the advertised brand was almost like following medical advice. Smoking was no longer presented simply as pleasurable or stylish. It was being recast as something nearly responsible. Other brands copied the same logic. Camel ran its More Doctors Smoke Camels campaign through the 1940s. That slogan did not only imply safety, it implied professional preference. The doctor was no longer just saying a cigarette was acceptable. He was choosing one for himself. The authority figure and the customer were being folded into the same ritual. Celebrity endorsements worked alongside this medical theater rather than replacing it. American Tobacco paid movie stars large sums in the late 1930s for Lucky Strike testimonials. The reason is plain enough. A doctor could calm fear. A movie star could glamorize the habit. Together, they created a double shield around the brand, one side respectable, the other seductive. That combination explains why this chapter belongs after the women targeting chapter. There, the cigarette was sold as self-improvement. Here, it was sold as approved self-improvement. A smoker was no longer asked to believe only that smoking looked modern. The advertisement now suggested that trusted institutions and admired public figures stood behind the act. That was a much stronger emotional structure. It wrapped appetite in reassurance. There was also a strategic advantage in borrowed authority. It let the brand speak through voices that looked external. A company praising its own product could sound interested. A doctor, an actress, or a singer seemed to arrive from outside the sales department. Even when the arrangement was paid or carefully staged, the performance depended on appearing independent. That illusion of independence was one of the most valuable things the advertiser could buy. This is the point where tobacco advertising begins to look less like ordinary promotion and more like credibility theater. The product did not change. The smoke did not change. What changed was the frame around it. The advertiser learned how to place the cigarette inside a borrowed halo. The star brought desire. The doctor brought trust. The slogan brought repetition. The customer was left with the feeling that the habit had already been examined and approved by people more glamorous or more knowledgeable than himself. That is what borrowed authority accomplished. It let tobacco advertising stop arguing from the product and start arguing from the witness. Once that happened, persuasion became much harder to resist because the cigarette was no longer standing alone. It was standing behind a white coat and beside a famous face. Chapter 10. The breakup that proved the method. On May 29, 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that the American Tobacco Combination violated the Sherman Act. That was the formal judgment. The practical meaning was simpler. The government had looked at one of the most powerful industrial systems in the country and decided it had become too large, too coordinated, and too hard to escape. That mattered because this was not only a legal defeat, it was proof of scale. For the whole story up to this point, the pattern has been building. Factory speed, packaging, collecting, borrowed glamour, advertising war, trust power, domestic presence, emotional persuasion, borrowed authority. The breakup matters because it shows these were never isolated tricks. They had become parts of one larger machine. The court was not reacting to a clever slogan. It was not reacting to a beautiful pack. It was reacting to a system that had fused production, brands, distribution, and promotion into one dominant force. The timing matters. The Supreme Court decision came in late May of 1911. The dissolution plan followed later that year. The trust had to be broken into separate concerns. Historical summaries vary a little in how they describe the reorganization, but the core point does not change. The old American tobacco structure could no longer remain intact. That is what gives this chapter its force. A trust can look abstract while it is still winning. It can look like business efficiency. It can look like superior organization. Once the federal government forces it apart, the method becomes easier to see. The American Tobacco Company had not only mastered manufacturing, it had built a market order around itself. Earlier histories describe it as a virtual monopoly over machine-made cigarettes. They also note the scale of factory control achieved through mergers and purchases. At that level, advertising was no longer just promotion. It had become part of the structure of power. There is another reason the breakup matters. It did not erase the methods that had built the trust. It preserved them. After dissolution, the industry did not return to some older and quieter age. The result was not 1,000 scattered firms. It was a new arrangement in which a few large companies still held most of the field. Different histories summarize the post-breakup order in slightly different ways, but they agree on the essential fact. A small number of major firms continued to dominate the tobacco market. That is the real payoff. The court proved that the American tobacco machine had become dangerous in law. The market proved that its methods remained useful in practice. A brand still needed visibility. A company still needed identity. A cigarette still needed to feel familiar, desirable, reassuring, or superior before it was bought. The legal shell changed. The persuasive habits remained alive. There is a darker irony here. The breakup can sound at first like a clean ending. Monopoly rises, government intervenes, competition is restored. The actual result was more complicated. The company had to be unwound through trademarks, product lines, assets, and brands. That detail matters because it reveals how deeply the system had penetrated the industry. A factory was one thing, a brand was another. A cigarette name was not just tobacco and paper, it was recognition, it was habit, it was loyalty built over years of repeated promotion. Once a court had to decide where those names belonged, the larger truth was obvious. The label had become an industrial asset of enormous value. So the breakup proved two things at once. It proved that the trust had become too powerful to ignore, and it proved that the advertising methods developed inside it had become too valuable to abandon. That is why this chapter belongs near the end of the documentary. It is not only the legal climax, it is the moment when the earlier argument comes fully into focus. The machine did not matter only because it made cigarettes quickly. The cards did not matter only because they were attractive. The beauty series did not matter only because they borrowed glamour. The doctor campaigns did not matter only because they borrowed trust. All of those things mattered because they were helping to build a durable system of commercial power. The breakup is where the country officially acknowledged that the system had gone too far. And yet the final lesson was not that the method had failed. It was that the method had worked too well. The American Tobacco Company was broken in court, but the way it taught companies to think about promotion, segmentation, authority, and scale did not vanish with the decree. The trust was dismantled. The blueprint remained. That is the unsettling payoff. The government could break the corporation. It could not unlearn the advertising logic the corporation had helped perfect. Chapter 11. What Tobacco Taught Madison Avenue. By the time the courts broke the tobacco trust, the deeper lesson had already escaped. The companies could be divided. The method could not. Tobacco did not invent every tool of modern advertising. It did something more practical. It helped industrialize several of them at once. It showed how a mass product could be pushed through visual identity, repeat contact, emotional association, premium incentives, demographic targeting, and borrowed authority. Earlier chapters trace those pieces one by one. Here they have to be seen together. The first lesson was that a package could sell. Tobacco firms learned early that the exterior of a product could do persuasive work before a clerk spoke. Labels, cards, and branded surfaces turned the pack into a small advertisement. That feels ordinary now because modern consumer goods do it constantly. In the late 19th century, it was a serious shift. A product could carry its own sales pitch into the store, the pocket, and the home. The second lesson was that advertising could reward the buyer. Tobacco cards stiffened the package, but they also promoted sales and fostered brand loyalty. That point goes to the heart of the matter. Tobacco companies learned that promotion worked better when it gave the customer something to keep, compare, trade, or complete. The same logic later appeared in premiums, trading stamps, coupons, and bonus items. Tobacco did not invent the pleasure of getting something extra. It helped prove how powerful that pleasure became when tied to repeat purchase. The third lesson was that brands could borrow interest from the rest of culture. Allen and Ginter did not fill its series only with tobacco scenes. It used flags, birds, buildings, athletes, singers, and national types. The important point is not just that the cards were attractive, it is that the brand learned how to live beside subjects people already cared about. Sport could lend energy, government buildings could lend seriousness, exotic birds could lend curiosity. The product no longer had to talk only about itself. That widening of subject matter is one of the clearest bridges from 19th century tobacco promotion to modern lifestyle branding. The fourth lesson was scale. In the year 1889, James B. Duke spent about 20% of gross sales on advertising. That matters because it shows tobacco advertising was not occasional decoration. It had become a budget line large enough to shape the structure of competition itself. Once that happened, advertising was no longer a flourish. It was part of how an industry fought. The fifth lesson was segmentation. A market did not have to be addressed as one undifferentiated crowd. It could be sliced by desire, aspiration, gender, status, and fear. Tobacco firms experimented with different visual worlds for different buyers. Athletes for one mood, beauties for another. Then later, women-focused cigarette campaigns aimed directly at slimness, self-presentation, and social permission. That was a recognizably modern move. The cigarette was being positioned not for everyone in the same way, but for different people through different needs. The sixth lesson was borrowed authority. A star could make a brand more glamorous. A doctor could make it feel more justified. That technique is instantly familiar because it survives so well. Modern advertising still leans on experts, celebrities, and testimonial voices whenever a product needs borrowed trust. Tobacco did not invent the witness. It refined the witness into a disciplined commercial tool. Put all of that together, and the larger inheritance comes into view. Packaging as persuasion, premiums as loyalty, culture as borrowed meaning, scale as force, segmentation as strategy, authority as theater. That combination is why tobacco mattered so much to the history of American advertising. It helped show how these elements could be coordinated around a mass-produced product. A card alone was clever. A slogan alone was memorable. A doctor alone was persuasive. Tobacco's larger achievement was to combine such things into a repeatable system. That is the part Madison Avenue could not ignore. And that is why the legacy is unsettling. These were brilliant methods. They were refined in the sale of cigarettes. The contradiction matters because it keeps the story honest. The same industry that helped normalize modern branding, loyalty devices, emotional targeting, and authority-based persuasion was selling a harmful product. The techniques looked innovative. The use made them darker. That is not a moral sermon. It is simply the historical fact that some of the most durable tools in American consumer persuasion were sharpened in tobacco's commercial wars. So what did tobacco teach Madison Avenue in the end? It taught that a product could be made memorable before it was tried. It taught that loyalty could be built with objects, not just claims. It taught that desire could be steered by identity, fear, and aspiration. It taught that trust could be borrowed. And it taught that when all those moves were organized together, advertising became something larger than promotion. It became infrastructure. Once American business learned that lesson, there was no putting it back. Chapter 12. The inheritance nobody could ignore. The cigarette campaigns changed. The factories changed. The companies changed. But the methods stayed alive. That is the final fact that matters most. Tobacco advertising did not survive because every old slogan survived. It survived because the habits of persuasion it refined kept proving useful. The Library of Congress describes tobacco cards as documents of advertising techniques used by American tobacco companies from the late 1800s through the 1940s. That is a revealing phrase. It means the archive is preserving more than curiosities. It is preserving a working grammar of promotion. The paradox is impossible to miss. An industry built around a harmful product helped sharpen some of the most durable tools of modern selling. It learned how to make a package speak. It learned how to make a bonus object build loyalty. It learned how to make sport, beauty, expertise, and freedom lean toward the brand. It learned how to repeat those moves at industrial scale. The inheritance was visual first. A tobacco card could carry a ball player, an actress, a flag, a bird, or a government building into the buyer's hand. An album could keep the promotion alive after the tobacco was gone. A household object could let the brand sit quietly in a room and return by familiarity rather than force. Duke's surviving tobacco card and advertising material collections make that afterlife visible in material form. What began as sales support became memory, decor, routine, and private possession. That last point is interpretive, but it fits the preserved albums, scrapbooks, and advertising objects themselves. The inheritance was strategic, too. George Washington Hill's late 1920s push for Lucky Strike showed how far the industry had moved from simple product description. In 1927, Hill geared Lucky Strike advertising toward women and created what contemporary histories describe as an industry sensation. That matters because it shows the later maturation of segmentation. The market was no longer treated as one public. It was divided into fears, identities, and aspirations that could be addressed separately. The inheritance was psychological. The women-targeted campaigns did not merely ask the public to like a cigarette. They asked the public to reinterpret it. A cigarette could be recoded as slimness, poise, independence, or modern self-command. Physician campaigns worked from another angle. Tobacco advertisers often used doctors so consumers would feel that smoking a particular brand was safe or medically acceptable. Once persuasion enters self-image and reassurance at that level, it is no longer just selling a product. It is helping script the meaning of the act itself. That is why the ending cannot be tidy. The trust was broken. The old campaigns aged. Some of the imagery now looks absurd and some of it looks sinister. But the logic proved stubborn. Modern advertising still depends on many of the same moves. Packaging still sells before the product is tried. Premiums and extras still reward loyalty. Brands still borrow meaning from culture. Markets are still segmented by identity and anxiety. Experts and celebrities still lend borrowed trust. Tobacco did not invent all of those methods, and this chapter should not claim that it did. It helped coordinate them, scale them, and demonstrate how effective they could become when used together around a mass product. That is the inheritance nobody could ignore. Not because tobacco deserved admiration, because the methods worked. They worked so well that they outlived the trust that sharpened them. They worked so well that other industries could borrow them without borrowing the whole history that produced them. A nation could condemn the cigarette company, regulate the cigarette company, even break up the cigarette company. But once the country had learned how effectively identity, loyalty, authority, and repetition could be organized around a brand, the lesson did not stay in tobacco. It moved outward into the wider culture of American advertising. So the final image should not be only smoke, it should be recognition. A card kept in an album, a doctor in an advertisement, a brand that feels familiar before it deserves to. That is what tobacco left behind, not just products, a persuasive system. And once American business saw what that system could do, there was no way to make the lesson disappear.